Every major news outlet right now is telling you that Iran's chief negotiator just resigned in Islamabad and that this means the peace talks are falling apart. They are wrong. Not because the resignation didn't happen, but because they are looking at the wrong actor. The resignation of Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf is not the story. The story is what Beijing has not said since it happened. And that silence, that surgical, deliberate, economically motivated silence tells you more about where this war ends and on whose terms than anything coming out of Islamabad or Washington. Let me walk you through this carefully, because this is one of those moments where the absence of a statement is the statement. Let us reset the frame entirely. Since February 28th of this year, the day the United States and Israel launched what they called Operation Epic Fury against Iran, we have been conditioned to see this conflict through a binary lens. America versus Iran, hawks versus diplomats, war versus peace. And now with Ghalibaf reportedly stepping down under pressure from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the media lens narrows further. Internal Iranian dysfunction, hardliners versus pragmatists, another failed negotiation cycle. But that frame misses the architecture beneath the event. It misses the third player who has been engineering outcomes from the shadows since the first bomb fell. And it misses the reason that players' silence right now is the most consequential diplomatic signal in this entire war. Here is my thesis, and I will spend the next 14 minutes proving it to you. Ghalibaf's resignation was not caused by internal Iranian politics. It was caused by a structural contradiction that China's positioning has created, one where Iran cannot negotiate on nuclear terms without conceding leverage that Beijing needs preserved, and cannot refuse negotiation without losing the only patron capable of shielding it from total economic collapse. China has engineered a corridor of silence because that silence gives it maximum optionality going into the May summit with Trump. Iran's negotiating team didn't fracture because of incompetence. It fractured because two external gravitational fields, American military pressure and Chinese economic leverage, are pulling Tehran in opposite directions, and no single negotiator can survive in that gap. Now let me walk you through what actually happened in the last 72 hours, because the details matter and most coverage is flattening them into uselessness. On or around April 23rd, reports surfaced, initially through Israeli Channel 12 and then confirmed by Iran International, that Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Iran's parliamentary speaker and the head of Iran's negotiating team with the United States, had resigned. The stated reason, interference by senior figures within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Ghalibaf had been the face of the April 11th Islamabad talks, where he sat across from Vice President J.D. Vance and came away with nothing. No agreement, no framework, gaps on every major issue. But the exact words matter here. According to multiple reports, Ghalibaf was reprimanded specifically for attempting to include the nuclear issue in the scope of the talks. Think about that. The man leading Iran's negotiations was punished for negotiating on the single issue that America says is the only issue. The IRGC, which now effectively controls Iran's security architecture after the assassination of Khamenei and the decimation of senior leadership, does not want the nuclear file on the table. Meanwhile, the United States will not discuss anything else until the nuclear file is on the table. Ghalibaf was the man trying to bridge that gap, and the bridge collapsed under him. Now here is where most people miss the deeper layer. Within hours of this resignation report, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was boarding a plane to Islamabad. The White House announced that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner would fly out to meet him. The ceasefire that Trump extended indefinitely on April 21st is still technically holding, even as Iran attacks ships in the Strait of Hormuz and the U.S. maintains its naval blockade. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth announced a second carrier joining the blockade. 3 American carrier strike groups are now operating simultaneously in the region for the first time since 2003. And yet, the door to talks remains cracked open. Not because either side wants peace in the abstract, but because both sides are running out of sustainable escalation options, and both are looking at China for different reasons. Let me pull the lens back, because the structural explanation here is what separates understanding from mere observation. Since the war began on February 28th, China has executed what I call a policy of strategic absence. Beijing condemned the strikes, yes, but without naming the United States or Israel directly. It sent a special envoy on a regional tour, made 26 phone calls through Wang Yi's office, hosted the Abu Dhabi Crown Prince, spoke with Saudi Arabia's MBS. But at no point did China confront Washington. At no point did it send military aid to Iran. At no point did it activate the comprehensive strategic partnership it signed with Tehran in 2021. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, threatening 40% of China's imported oil, Beijing's response was to call for all parties to cease hostilities and return to negotiation. That is a phrase designed to sound like diplomacy but function as abandonment. And this is the hidden structure that explains Ghalibaf's resignation. China's strategic absence is not passive. It is architecturally active. By refusing to back Iran militarily or diplomatically, Beijing has created a pressure gradient inside Tehran. The pragmatists, people like Ghalibaf, Araghchi, President Pezeshkian, understand that without Chinese economic support, Iran cannot survive a prolonged war against the United States. Iran's oil exports go almost entirely to China. 90% of Iranian crude goes to Chinese refineries. China is Iran's largest trading partner and its only significant economic lifeline under sanctions. The pragmatists therefore want to negotiate and negotiate seriously, including on the nuclear question, because that is the only path to sanctions relief and economic survival. But the IRGC operates under a different logic. For the Revolutionary Guards, the nuclear program is not a bargaining chip. It is an existential guarantee. After watching what happened to Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Gaddafi's Libya, both of which abandoned their weapons programs and were subsequently destroyed, the IRGC will not surrender enrichment capability under any circumstances. They would rather fight a losing war than negotiate away the one asset they believe prevents regime termination. And here is the critical variable. The IRGC knows that China's offer to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium, the roughly 440 kilograms of 60% enriched material that Trump demands be removed, is not a rescue. It is a transfer of leverage from Tehran to Beijing. This is what I call the uranium custody trap. China has signaled through diplomatic channels that it is willing to either take physical custody of Iran's enriched uranium or downblend it to civilian-grade levels. On the surface, this looks like a constructive compromise, a way to satisfy American demands without completely stripping Iran of nuclear dignity. But examine the incentive structure. If China holds Iran's uranium, China becomes the gatekeeper of Iran's nuclear future. Beijing would gain permanent leverage over Tehran, the ability to return or withhold that material based on Iran's compliance with Chinese strategic preferences. Iran would go from being a nuclear threshold state to being a nuclear-dependent client of China. The IRGC sees this clearly, even if the pragmatists are willing to accept it as the price of survival. Now let me take you through the historical pattern, because this is not the first time we have seen this dynamic, and recognizing the rhythm is essential to seeing where it leads. There is a recurring pattern in great power conflicts where a secondary state caught between two superpowers sees its negotiating team fracture along exactly this fault line: those who want to accommodate the dominant military power versus those who refuse to surrender the state's core deterrent. We saw it in North Korea in the early 2000s, when the six-party talks repeatedly stalled because Pyongyang's military establishment refused concessions that China's economic leverage was pushing the diplomatic wing to accept. We saw it in Pakistan itself in the late 1990s, when the civilian government under Nawaz Sharif considered freezing the nuclear program under American pressure, only to be overridden by the military establishment. We saw it in Iraq in 2002 and 2003, when the gap between what Saddam's diplomatic team was willing to concede and what his security apparatus would permit became the space through which the invasion was launched. The pattern is always the same. External pressure from a military superpower creates demand for negotiation. External pressure from an economic patron creates demand for compliance. The internal security establishment, which controls the contested asset, whether nuclear material, territorial claims, or strategic weapons, refuses both. The negotiator becomes the sacrificial figure, crushed between forces too large to reconcile. Ghalibaf is this war's version of that figure. His resignation is not a personnel change. It is a structural symptom. And what makes this iteration uniquely dangerous is China's dual positioning. In every previous case, the economic patron and the military threat were different actors pushing in the same direction. China pressured North Korea toward talks. America pressured North Korea toward talks. The directions converged even if the motives differed. But in the current Iran crisis, China's silence is not pushing Iran toward a deal. China's silence is preserving China's optionality. And that is a fundamentally different dynamic. Let me expand the scope here because the Ghalibaf resignation is a symptom of something larger than the Iran war itself. What we are watching is the emergence of what I would call asymmetric patron leverage, a new form of great power competition, where the patron state gains power not by backing its client, but by strategically withholding support at precisely calibrated moments. China is not abandoning Iran. Abandonment would be a clean break, a termination of the relationship. What China is doing is far more sophisticated. It is maintaining the relationship while modulating the level of support in real time, adjusting the dial based on what maximizes Beijing's position relative to Washington. Consider the timeline. Trump is scheduled to visit Beijing on May 14th and 15th. That summit is the gravitational center of Chinese foreign policy right now. Xi Jinping wants a trade deal. He wants tariff relief. He wants a stable framework for Taiwan. He has already secured Trump's agreement to delay arms sales to Taiwan. Now, by positioning itself as a potential custodian of Iran's uranium, China creates a chit it can play at the May summit. It can offer Trump the appearance of a diplomatic breakthrough on Iran. China takes the uranium, the nuclear threat is neutralized, and in exchange receive concessions on trade, tariffs, or Taiwan that would be impossible to extract in any other context. This is the real game. The real question is not whether Iran's negotiating team can be reassembled. The real question is what price China extracts from both sides for providing the solution that neither can achieve alone. Iran cannot disarm without a custodian it trusts more than America. America cannot verify disarmament without a partner who has physical access to Iran. China is the only actor that fits both requirements. And by remaining silent while Ghalibaf falls, while Araghchi scrambles to Islamabad, while 3 carrier strike groups circle the Persian Gulf, China allows the pressure to build to the precise level where its intervention becomes not just welcome but necessary. Pull the lens back one more time and look at what this means for the international system. We are watching the real-time construction of a new model of great power influence, one that does not depend on military intervention, alliance treaties, or even public diplomacy. It depends on economic dependency and calibrated silence. China buys 90% of Iran's oil. China is America's 3rd largest trading partner. China holds the potential solution to the nuclear question. And China has said almost nothing. That silence is not confusion. It is not indifference. It is the sound of leverage being accumulated. Every day that the war continues without resolution, China's position strengthens. Every ship that is attacked in the Strait of Hormuz reminds the world that energy security depends on this conflict ending. Every failed round of talks in Islamabad demonstrates that bilateral negotiation between Washington and Tehran is insufficient. And every resigned negotiator proves that Iran's internal contradictions cannot be resolved without an external guarantor willing to absorb the nuclear risk. The meaning of Ghalibaf's resignation is therefore not what the headlines suggest. It does not mean Iran's government is collapsing or that hardliners have won. It means that the structural conditions for a deal have not yet been met because the third party that must underwrite the deal has not yet decided to activate. China is waiting. It is waiting for the price to be right. It is waiting for Trump to arrive in Beijing with enough desperation to make real concessions. It is waiting for Iran to exhaust its internal alternatives and accept custodial dependence. It is waiting for the Strait of Hormuz crisis to make the cost of continued silence higher than the cost of engagement. When China finally speaks, and it will speak, the terms will already be set, not by Washington, not by Tehran, by Beijing. And so, as I leave you with this, consider what kind of international system we are building when the most powerful move available to a great power is not action, but strategic withholding. When the patron gains more from its client's suffering than from its client's success, when silence becomes the most potent form of leverage, 3,000 years of diplomatic history teach us that empires rise by what they build and fall by what they permit. The question now is whether we are watching China build a new order or watching the old one be permitted to die while Beijing calculates the optimal moment to offer resurrection at a price only it can name. If you found this analysis valuable, if this is the kind of structural, pattern-based thinking that helps you see the real architecture beneath the headlines, then subscribe and add this channel to your watch list. We do not do surface here. We do not do panic. We do structure systems in the long game, because understanding power is not a luxury. In times like these, it is a civic obligation. I will see you in the next one.